On first view of our text today, where it says, "Wives, submit to your husband," this would be for someone who didn't really understand those words a time to probably run for that door. But if we look at it in today's, if we look at it at look at it in today's verses as we look at the verses in Colossians 3, if we look at it through the eyes that understand the message that we've been given over the last few weeks from chapters 1 and 2 of Colossians, we should hold fast. For chapters 1 and 2 that teach the priority of Christ in a Christian life. These verses teach that Christ is first and before everything else. That Christ is central. Christ is the head. Christ is the head of the church. He is central in our salvation. And more importantly, that he might live through us. So that we might take off the old and put on the new. So, the question before us today in our text is, when you take off the old self and put on the new one, how do you deal with old relationships? As I thought of old relationships, this came to mind. Last Monday at Hope Show, I had 3 farmers who I had not seen, 2 for quite some time, but 1 for 33 years. I actually didn't recognise him. He's changed, but apparently so have I. And they all 3 came to look at me because they had heard that me, Philip Pennington, who used to be one for getting up to all sorts of things that we probably won't go into today, that he was giving out gospels and telling of the salvation found at the cross of Jesus Christ. They couldn't believe what they'd been told and had to come and see it with their own eyes. So as we go to our text in verse 18 of Colossians 3, keep that encounter in mind. That encounter with my old friends. Keep it in mind. Think of how our actions and behaviours, our relationships with Christ look to those who don't know Jesus as Lord and Saviour. So verse 18 and 19 say this: "Wives, submit to your husband as is fitting in the Lord. Husbands, love your wives and do not be harsh to them." Probably slip up a bit with that one, but so let's first consider husbands and wives. There is much confusion in today's society about marriage. There are those who would promote same-sex marriage. Others see marriage as oppressive and outdated. Some, I've even heard them advocate living together before marriage. The biblical understanding of marriage seems to have been lost. Marriage was established by God, not by man. Paul talks in the first few verses of Colossians of living a life worthy of the Lord. But in verse 18 that we're looking at to start today, he shifts his attention to the home, a home that is a true testing ground for values and how you live within them 4 walls. So, wives, submit to your husband as is fitting in the Lord. Provocative words in a modern world. So, let's look at Ephesians 5. Wives, submit to your husband, to your own husband, as you do the Lord. That's the thing. As you do the Lord. As you do the Lord. Real Christian wives truly submit to the Lord. The Lord who cares for them. The Lord who is fully concerned for them. The Lord who is clothed in humility, in compassion, kindness and love. Quite high standards for us husbands to step up to there. So many of us, unfortunately, do fall short. That's why Paul tells in this text, husbands, love your wives and do not be harsh towards them. The wife's submission and the husband's loving go hand in hand to achieve a godly marriage and maybe a delightful marriage. I'm just looking at Anne's face back there. It doesn't look very convinced, but I do try my best. Mutual submission within a Christian marriage. Two different roles working together. That should be the aim. Verse 23 of Ephesians 5 says this, for the husband is head of the wife as Christ is head of the church. For me, this is a very important comparison. The comparing of the marriage of a man and a woman to Christ and his church. Because the church submits to God. So, in turn, the wife should submit to the authority of her husband. You wouldn't believe how many times I've had my head bitten off over that one as I've tried to tell it to other people. The wife should submit to the authority of her husband, with the husband showing that list, showing the love of Christ. The love of Christ that endured the cross for his church. Can you imagine being nailed to a cross? I've tried to imagine it. I'm guessing it proper hurts. He did that out of love. The same love that a husband should show to his wife. And together, and they pull those things together, submission of the wife and the love of Christ from the husband, you get a Christ-centered marriage that honors God. That's the whole idea. It is a proper order, godly marriage, a happy marriage in a broken world. For a marriage that lives out God's commands is a very powerful testimony. A lot stronger than me standing there last weekend giving out gospels. That is a very powerful message. Verses 20 and 21 go on and say this, children, obey your parents in everything, for this pleases the Lord. Wow. I see lots of children in the world with parents, and I don't see very much of that. Carries on to say, fathers, do not embitter your children, or they will become discouraged. This verse is about parental relationships. Obedience pleases God. It is right in his sight. That in itself should be a reason for children to want to obey. Honor your father and mother, the fifth commandment says. Honor to the parents from a child anchors society and binds children to the parents in the community of faith. Anything else dishonors the Lord. So, fathers, do not embitter your children, because a God-centered family are good for society. When God, who ordained family life, gives instruction on how it should be operated, it must be listened to, because this is the way that life was meant to be. A family where love and happiness prosper. As a father, if I am honest, I have almost certainly embittered my children, but on occasion, but probably quite a few occasions, which in turn will have discouraged them, I'm sure. This was mainly prior to me coming to faith. As I tried to prepare them for adulthood and the trials of this world, I think in hindsight I expected too high a standard. And if I were to examine myself, strangely, it's probably a standard I didn't meet up to at that time myself. But the Lord has seen fit to reveal to me the error. And I do not wish to make that same mistake with my grandchildren. So I'll give you a little story. I watched my 3-year-old grandson the other day copy me. I was putting a hinge on a gate, and he's quite an industrious little fella. He managed to put a hinge on the gate upside down, and it was quite loose. And I found myself praising and encouraging him for his efforts. That wasn't the old me. I probably would have, it wouldn't be my reaction back then. The old me with my, the way before I was saved was completely different. And maybe that's something I need to address with my children. Verse 22 says, "Slaves, obey your earthly masters in everything, and do it not only when there is an eye on you, and to curry the favor, but with sincerity of the heart and reverence for the Lord." Well, how do we explain this one? We don't have slaves today, do we, really? But we do have employers and employees. And I will use them, I think, today to explain this text. Obey your employer or your boss, not only when he's in sight. I once worked with a young man some years ago who used to pretty well sit around doing nothing until the boss arrived, and then he'd jump up and look very industrious and busy. I don't think that would have been a good witness for the Lord. His actions were quite wrong. But I once had a young man who came to work on the farm for me some time ago now. I think it's probably 9 years ago. Who was a minister's son. He's honestly the best worker I've ever had. I could leave him a list of jobs, and it used to get longer every day. And when I came back, he'd done that and found something else to do. You don't see that very often. Sam was his name. He was one of the reasons, as dealing with him on a daily basis, why I, as a non-believer, started to look at Christianity. Because he had this incredible work ethic. It was unbelievable. And I used to go back to their house when I dropped him off after work. And they had quite a lot of children. They were like everywhere. I can't even remember how many they were. But they were always working and doing something. They were always busy. Polite and just lovely, godly children. He had a work ethic that came from this text. He worked with sincerity of the heart and reverence for the Lord. He worked, and that lad really did work with all his heart for the Lord. Not for me, as his employer, but I didn't realise at the time, but he was doing it as a witness. And what a witness that is. So there's a huge lesson there. Chapter 4 continues on in verse 1. To masters or employers, the text tells us to be fair and just to employees, remembering all the time they are people created in God's image. Created in God's image. I know several Christian employers that would do well to read them verses. Christians who treat people in the workplace as commodities. I've often wondered about it. Is it because they don't see them as brothers and sisters? I don't know. But I've seen this a lot with these particular friends of mine who treat people as commodities to further their profits instead of paying them their true value for their day's toil. Christians who profess to know the Lord, who spend many thousands on top of the range cars and huge houses, clothes that I can't imagine what they cost, and abundances of expensive holidays. They do this while keeping their workers on low wages. Do they think that's a good witness for God? If you read that text, there's nothing wrong with an employer making money. The Lord says you must treat them fairly. So employers, provide your employees with what is right and fair, because you know you have a master in heaven. A master in heaven to whom we are accountable. So in this place today we have employees, we have the employed, we have husbands, we have wives, we would generally have children, parents. We have all these things in this place. So I have a question. Wives, can you submit to your husbands because Christ is living through you? Because Christ is your priority. Husbands, can you love your wives because Christ is living in you? Children, if there were children here, I could ask them, do you obey your parents because Christ is living through you? Fathers or parents, do you encourage your children because Christ is living through you? Employers or employees, can you work, serve and benefit one another? Imagine that. Can you work, serve and benefit one another? because Christ would be working in you if you did that. He would be working in you and through you. So wives, husbands, children, employers, employees, these verses in Colossians are for you. They are full of instruction. Instruction, I think, that if you try to do it in your own strength, would be folly. But what's the answer? It's to surrender to Christ. Let him live through us. So our witness for Christ would be true and the glory would be the Lord.